Okay guys, welcome to Blender. I'm going to show you today how to set up quite a simple scene, the one that we've got right here. This is using textures that are downloaded online and a simple lighting setup to basically introduce you guys to the user interface and the texturing system within Blender. So this setup is what I'm going to show you guys how to create today, so let's get started. I am using Blender version 3.31, which you can see right here. So make sure you're using the latest version. You can download this online. Blender's totally free, so let's get started. The default setup will start with this cube and a camera. So if you've never been to Blender before, I'll quickly explain what you're looking at. This is the viewport scene. You can navigate this by using this gizmo up here. If you just click and drag around, you can navigate rotation. You can zoom in and out by clicking and dragging in the magnifying glass, and you can pan the screen by clicking in the hand. These are also accessible as shortcuts, so holding Alt and clicking will allow you to rotate. Alt and Shift will allow you to pan like this, and Alt and Control will allow you to zoom in and out. So this is how you can navigate around the viewport setting. There are these different workspaces up here. So if you look, you can enter the modeling workspace, which will take you into edit mode, where we could now, if we wanted to model this cube, we can go into sculpting mode, where we could sculpt on this cube. We can go to UV editing mode, where we can look at the UV layouts of this cube that's here. Texture paint mode, where we can paint on the textures. Shading mode, which will take us into a workspace where we can edit the shader, animation, rendering, compositing, geometry nodes, and scripting. The ones we're going to look at today is we'll be working in the layout mode, and then we'll be looking briefly at the end in the compositing mode. So to start off with, we'll stay in the layout mode, and we'll just do some quick setup to make sure the scene is got all the right settings. So the first thing we want to do is check which render engine we're using. So we're going to come to this panel on the side here, this property editor, and you will have a picture that looks like the back of a camera, and if we click this, this will be our render engine and our render engine settings. Now by default this is set to Eevee, and we want to transfer this to cycles, and to do that just drop down this menu and choose cycles. Again, by default this will go to run on the device called CPU, and we want to run this on GPU compute. The reason for this is we want the rendering to happen on the GPU and not on the CPU if you've got a good graphics card. If you don't have a graphics card that you can use, then you might have to stay on CPU. We want to check that we're running on GPU now in the system preferences. So if we go to edit in the top left and choose preferences, under the system option there's these various preferences that we can look at. Under the system option, we want to check that we have our cycles render device set to optics. We can have CUDA, but if you've got a RTX graphics card, you can use optics to activate the ray tracing. And you want to check your NVIDIA cards and uncheck your CPU. It would be the same for CUDA, for optics, and depending on your other setup. But just make sure your graphics cards are checked and your CPU is unchecked, so it only renders on the graphics cards. So that's a bit of setup to check before we get started. The one thing that we do need to activate in order to set up these textures is the Node Wrangler add-on. So if we go to Edit, Preferences, and to Add-ons, in here we can perform a search for existing add-ons, and if we type in Node, there is this one in the bottom called Node Wrangler. So check this box if it's not already checked. If you've just opened Blender for the first time, you might need to check this once. Check this, and then we know that we are running with Node Wrangler, and this should speed up our process a bit today. So make sure this add-on is activated, and then you can exit this screen. What we are going to need to get started is to have some texture files. So what I am using is the Rocks Ground 2 texture from Polyhaven. So if you guys want to go to Polyhaven to download this texture, there's a lot of things in this site that you can work with. Lots of free assets for download here, so this is a good resource to know. And what I've done is chosen the zip option, this drop down menu here. You can download a Blender file with the texture already set, but we're not going to do that today. So uncheck Blender, uncheck GLTF, and then you can uncheck this AR rough metal. This is a combined map that we're not going to use today. We're just going to use the ambient occlusion, the diffuse, the displacement, the normal GL, not the normal DX, the normal GL, and a roughness map. So if you check these textures are all in a PNG format and click download, your textures will download into a zip file, and they should look something like this when you download them. You'll have a folder of these 5 textures, and this is what we need to work with today. So make sure you have these 5 textures downloaded, and we can start to work in Blender. Just a quick note on folder structure. I've set up a folder system here for this project. I have a Blender folder where I can save my scenes, a HDRI folder where I save a lighting, a render folder where I save the final renders, and a texture folder where I save the textures. So it's good to have a good folder structure when you're working, so you can always find the things that you're working with. So just a bit of advice on setting up your folder so you know where everything is. Now we are going to start to work on the texture setup. So we can delete this cube, and to do that we can select the cube. We know it's selected because it will have this orange outliner, and press X on the keyboard and you will get the delete option, and just hit delete. We want to add into this scene a plane to project this texture on that we've downloaded. So to add a plane, we press Shift and A to add, we go to the mesh option, and then we click plane, and now we have a plane added to the scene. When you're in this layout mode, if you press N on the keyboard, you will see this menu come out at the side that gives you various options for add-ons that you might have, or for tools and different views. What we're looking at now is the item view, and we can see under dimensions that this plane is 2 meters by 2 meters wide. So one edge is 2 meters wide and the other edge is 2 meters wide, so this is quite a good size plane to work with. We can change these dimensions either by changing dimensions here or changing the scaling values here. For now, we're going to leave this scaling at 2 meters because this is fine to work with. But what we need to do is to add some subdivision to this plane, because right now what we have, if we look in wireframe view, up here on the right side of the screen we have different view options. So the first one right here, this kind of circle with the lines through it, is a wireframe where we will see the mesh as a wireframe. The next one is shaded view, which will show just basic mesh with faces all filled. The next one will be viewport shading, so this will show us any shading that's applied to our any materials that are applied. Right now we don't have any materials applied, so it shows us white. And then the final one is render view, so this will be the render view for cycles that we set up earlier. Looking at this in wireframe view, we see that we just have 4 edges, and we want to have a high density mesh in order to be able to displace and use the displacement map for this texture. So in order to set this up, what we need to do is choose this little wrench icon to the right side, click this wrench and add a modifier with this drop down menu here, and choose the subdivision surface modifier. So that's under this wrench, add modifier, and then we can add a subdivision surface. To start off with, our plane will turn into like an octagon, and that's because we have this mode here, Catmull Clark, is activated. And what that will do is smooth out all the edges to create a very smooth finish, which is very useful when modeling, but in this instance we want to keep the square shape of our plane. So what we will do is turn from Catmull to simple, and that will give us the square. Right now we can't see the additional mesh that we've generated because of this optimal display box is checked. If we uncheck this box, we can see how this mesh is beginning to be divided. So in the viewport levels we have 2 divisions, and in the render level we have 2 divisions. The render levels will be what is applied during the rendering, and the viewport is applied in what we are seeing. So if we want to work with a lower resolution in the viewport to speed the computing up, that's fine. And then in the rendering we can have a higher density. Right now I'm just going to look at the levels in the viewport, and then we can look at the render levels after. So I'm going to add 5 levels of subdivision to this to get a lot of density in this mesh, and then I'm going to apply this modifier so that this is now applied to the plane. I'm going to then add another subdivision modifier, turn off optimal display again, and I'm going to add another 2 levels to make this mesh even more intense. But this time I've left the Catmull-Clark option activated, so that will allow for some softness when this gets displaced, and you'll see the edges are rounded off very slightly, but this is fine because we still have a plane. We can increase this again as we start to add the textures, but what this gives us now is a mesh with a very fine surface that when we add the displacement map we can get some nice 3D information generated on this mesh. So we're going to go back into viewport shaded mode for a minute, and we're going to set up the textures. What I will just note at this point is it's good to work with collections. So as we're starting to create scene items, I would select the plane. I would double click on this item in the outliner, and you can rename it, and I'll name this ground. And then what I'm going to do with ground selected is hit M on the keyboard, and it will allow me to move this to a new collection. So M for move to new collection, hit new collection, and then just type in scene items, or as whatever you want to describe these items. Make a new collection, and now any scene objects we can place in here, and in this one we could rename this lights camera, so that all the lights and camera information items that we're going to create we can put in this collection, and any scene items we can put in this collection. Again, this is just a nice way to organize how you're working so that you don't end up with a big confusing list of items that you don't know what they are. So make sure to rename things and put things in collections as you go along. To start some texturing, what I'm going to do is split this workspace, and I'm going to do that by right clicking on this join here, so this window join here where we can make this wider and narrower. Hover your mouse in this space till the mouse kind of splits into this different arrow. Right click and click vertical split, and that will allow us to split this window into 2 separate windows. And to start with, what we want to do is turn this window into viewport shading, so that is this 3rd icon here. The scene will stay white, but we'll start to see texture information happen here. And then what we want to see on this side is the shader editor. So in order to view that, we can drop down this icon right here, and this will give us different workspaces that we can look at. And what we want to look at is the shader editor under general on the left side. Hit that, and it will take us into the shader editor view. So if we select ground, currently there's nothing in here. Like I said before, N lets these menus drop in and out if you hit N on the keyboard. So again here, if we want to drop this menu out, just hit N and it will disappear. Under ground, we now want to add a material to this. So make sure you have your ground plane selected either in the outliner on the right side or in the scene. You know it's selected because it will be highlighted in orange or selected here in the outliner. Come to the right side and choose this red circular icon, and this will be where we can now add material information. So we want to add a new material, so click the new button and we will get a material added to the scene. We'll rename this, double click again in this space, and we can call this ground, so we know that this is the ground material and everything is following a similar naming so that we can find things. And automatically we will have this PBR principled BSDF workflow. So keep this in the scene, and to navigate this area you can use your middle mouse button to click and drag around. This will help you navigate here, and you can roll the mouse in and out to kind of zoom in and out of this space. We're going to now set up this texture to start to see what we can work on, but basically a quick introduction to what this is it allows us to have controls over various different aspects of this surface. So if I look at this in rendered view, which would be the last icon right here, I can change the color of this, for example, to green. I could reduce the roughness of this to make it look shiny. There's not enough lights in the scene to see this. I could use the metallic to make this look metallic. This will give us control over different aspects, but what we want to do is attach the maps that we have just downloaded. So here, yeah, you can see the metallic, how that has an effect, the roughness, how this is having an effect. But we're going to use the maps that we've just created, and to do that, because we've activated Node Wrangler earlier, if we select this shader, and we know it's selected because we're grabbing it and it's highlighted in white, select this shader, press Ctrl, Shift and T on the keyboard, and it will open up this this window, and I'm going to navigate to my the folder structure that I created and to where I downloaded this Rocks Grand 2 textures. So this guy that we downloaded is the files that we're going to navigate to now, and I'm just going to select, if you want to view these files in this list, just click on the right side here, these four icons, and you'll see this as more of a visual thing rather than a list thing. So this is more visual. You can select all these all together and then click Principled Setup, and automatically Node Wrangler will set this texture up for you in a way that Blender understands. And you'll see immediately we have a representation of this texture on the surface immediately. The thing is that this is still flat, and we still want to do a little bit of extra work manually in this structure so that we can set things up. But I'll just explain what this is. This mapping allows us to change the tiling and the offset of the tiles or the rotation of the tiles for this. So for example, this is currently one tile across a 2-meter plane, so one tile of the texture is projected. If I look here under scale, I can change this scale. For example, if I change the X value and the Y value to 2, I will now have 2 tiles projected across this plane, and the textures will look a little bit finer. So this can allow us to change the scaling of the textures, and the rotations will allow us to change the rotations of the textures. So if I use Y, I will rotate one way, and if I use the Z, I will rotate another way. But right now, we're just going to leave this set to 1 and to 1. So we have 1 scaling. This is the base color, this is the roughness, this is the normal, this is the displacement. The normal will tell Blender how light will affect this, the surface. So if I look at it in render view, and I disconnect the base color, and I turn this back to white, you'll see that there's still a lot of detail information on this plane, even without the color attached, and all that detail is coming from the normal and the displacement at this point, as well as some roughness information. So this level of detail is generated by these nodes right here, these bottom 3. The base color is giving us a color on the surface, and currently the ambient occlusion is not connected. So what we want to do is now connect this ambient occlusion into this node structure, and then to add some displacement. So the way we will add the ambient occlusion, which is this guy right here, who's currently not connected to anybody, is to press Shift and A on the keyboard, press search, and type in mix RGB. This will be the first option that you get. So choose mix and place that just next to this guy right here. Shift and A will be how you add a node. Like I said, the middle mouse button will help you move around here, and the mouse wheel will help you scroll in and out of here. So now we can see the setup that we want. I'm just going to move some of these over so we've got a bit of space. And what we want to do now is connect the ambient occlusion into color 2. And we want to take the base color and plug this into color 1. And that will disconnect the colors here. To change these connections, you just drag these out. You can drag a new connection out of here. Just click the icons and drag. We're going to change mix from mix to multiply, and then drag color into base color. And what that will do now is it will give us this control of more definition in the shadow. So if I set this to 0, the surface will become a little bit lighter, and if I set this to 1, it will become a little bit darker. You see that change? And that will just push some darkness into the shadows between all these rocks and these edges. It's not much, but it can add in a lot of detail as we start to go forward. So I'm going to keep this set to 1 for now. The reason why this goes to 2 and this goes to 1 is if we switch these around by just dragging them the opposite way, this controller will now control the amount of base color rather than the amount of shadow. So by having these stacked the other way, we now have control over the amount of shadow and not the amount of base color. So that's why the order that you connect these two in is important. If these are connected the other way, the shadows, the mixing will work in the other direction. So just make sure you have these plugged in this way. And that has now set up the ambient occlusion. I'm going to hit N to close this menu and have a bit more space here. We're still looking at this in rendered view. So as this is rendering now, we can look at the displacement options. So in order to do that, we want to look under the material settings on this side. So if under surface we close this menu down, we can look at the displacement options here. The option we want is not actually in this displacement menu, it's in the settings underneath. It's a bit hidden away, but if you go to the settings icon underneath, you have a displacement option underneath surface. And in this displacement option, you drop this menu down and click displacement and bump, and we will now get displacement happening on this mesh. So this is quite an extreme amount of displacement. This is far too much. It's very, very noisy. And the way we can fix that is by going to the displacement scale right here in this node. And the second option is called scale. And we want to turn this down to maybe 0.25. Hit enter and we will get a lot less displacement, but we will have a surface that looks a lot more three-dimensional than we had it before. So this is working. One thing we want to check, we have some quite hard edges here on this plane right now that you can see kind of poking around. So if we choose the mesh and we right click and click shade smooth, so right click on the mesh, shade smooth, the mesh shading should smooth out a bit, but it's still a little bit blocky in areas. So we can improve that by going on the right side of the screen, back to modifiers, back to subdivision, and increase these levels by 1. So we'll go to 3 and to 3 for rendered, and we should reduce that amount of blockiness by increasing the resolution. We could try 4, yeah, it'll give us a bit more detail. So we'll put 4 into both. That, I think, is a good setup for the texture so far. So you'll see that we now have 3D information happening. We have a shadow control here that we can push up and down as we like. We have control over the normal strength, which maybe we could bring down a little bit. And we generally have a nice displacement happening across this surface. What you will notice now though is if we want to tile this surface, so say we want to have 2 tiles on the X and 2 tiles on the Y, the displacement scale is getting higher and higher and higher. So again, if we do 3 tiles by 3 tiles, the displacement again is being pushed up, up and up because we're not changing the scaling factor. There's a nice way to connect all of this so that we just enter one number, and we're going to do that using drivers. So what that means is if we set both of these scaling values from 1 back to 1, we know that one scaling value here equals 0.25 scaling values here. So this has a 0.25 and this has a 1. We can connect these quite easily, and the way we will do that is to add drivers between. The first driver we're going to add is from X to Y. So if we right click on X and click copy as new driver, and then navigate to Y, right click and click paste driver. this driver, we know there's driver in here because this slot has now gone like purple, and if I enter 2 in the top one, 2 will appear in the second one. So now I only need to enter this one number in order to activate the both coordinates, which is quicker, but it's still not affected the scaling right here. The way we're going to affect the scaling is to add a math node. So press Shift and A on the keyboard, search and type in math, and you'll get this math node. What we want to do with this math node is the first value we enter is 0.25 because that's the scaling we have here, so 0.25. And the secondary value is going to be this value right here, which will be the x coordinate. So if we copy this, copy as new driver here, and in the bottom we paste this driver, and we turn this from addition to divide. What that will do now is divide 0.25 by whichever value we enter here. So if we connect this value socket to the scale socket, the scaling is the same. However, now if we change the X tiling to 4, we have 4 tiles, but our scaling of our displacement stays the same. We have the same amount of offset with these rocks. So if we change this to 2, we have a bigger tiling, but we still have the right offset amount with these rocks for the displacement. If you then want to adjust this displacement, you think this might be a little bit high, you can still change this value in the top of this division node to reduce the scaling globally as this changes. So if we want to do 0.24 to just have a little change, you can still make those changes because everything is now connected with a math node and a driver. So that will mean that as you tile this texture, these things are connected. So the only thing you need to be concerned for now with tiling is this X scale. So I'll put this to 1 because that's fine for this scene that I'm making right now. Actually, let's have 2. It looks nice with 2. Yes. So what we want to do now is, if we look back at the original scene, is we have this world light here in the background, which is missing from our current scene. So we're going to add in the world light, and then we're going to add in some camera options as well. So the world light that I'm using is actually from the same website from Polyhaven. I'm using an environment light called Autumn Forest 4, and I have this selected at 2K as the EXR option, and then I just hit download, and then in my folder structure, in my HDRI folder, I have this EXR already downloaded, so we can work with this in the scene. Working with an environment light is very similar to working with textures. The workspace is very similar, and the way we access that workspace is here. We have the object option. We're going to drop down this object menu and click world, and this will take us to this world texturing, this world environment space. And again, the controls are the same. Use your middle mouse button to kind of pan around, and use your mouse wheel to scroll in and out. By default, this is your background color, which is gray, which is this gray value right here. So if I change this gray value here to white, my world light will turn to white, and I'll have this quite bright light. But what we want to do is add our own background light to this, and because we've got Node Wrangler activated, we can use a shortcut to do this, and we press Control T, and it will bring up this this texture setup here. It will drop to pink because there's nothing connected. So if you ever see pink in textures or pink on an object like this, it means that the image node doesn't have an image attached to it, which here it doesn't. So we're going to go to Open. We're going to navigate to the folders that we've got. We're going to go to HDRI, choose this light, and click Open Image. And this light will be brought into the scene. And this mapping control here allows us to have some controls over how this light is working. So the one that is quite useful is the Z rotation, that if I change this Z rotation right here, I'm just clicking and dragging left and right in this box. So click and drag, and it will just allow you to kind of roll the HDRI around. I want to just roll it around until the sun is kind of poking through the trees in the back. About here. and I'm going to change the location on this z-axis here for location. If I put a very small number such as 0.1, the environment will shift down a little bit, and if I put minus 0.1, the environment will shift up a little bit. So I've just shifted this up a tiny bit so it's nearer to the floor, and then I've just used this rotation to rotate the light around. The one thing we can do now is we have this light in the outliner here in the scene. We don't need this light anymore because we've created this world light. So just go here and hit delete on the keyboard, and that light will be deleted. And now we're just working with our scene light. So we're almost getting to the point of hitting the render button. What we want to look at now is, instead of being in this world editor mode, just before we leave, let's look at the strength, because this strength value will operate the intensity of this light. So if your light is a bit too bright for whatever reason, you could drop this down to 0.5 and it will be a half brightness, or you could push this up to 2 and it will be double strength. I think I'll go to about 0.75 to give it this kind of darker autumn feeling, maybe 0.85, something like this. So that gives us a strength control and a rotation control for our lighting in the environment. What we want to do now is look at the 3D viewport as well as the rendered viewport at the same time, and to do that we can use this same window that we split right here, and I'll drop down this menu here to look at the workspaces again, clicking this icon in the middle of the screen. Then I'll go to 3D viewport, and now I'm viewing the 3D scene alongside the render scene. These are both 3D viewports, but this one I'm going to edit the camera setup so I can see what's happening here. So to fix the camera into view, if we go into this side and I press Control, Alt and number pad 0, my camera kind of pops into the middle of the display. So right now you see this square here is my frame of my image. And if I use the zoom option, I can kind of zoom in and out, but I'm just zooming the frame. This is easier to view if you select the camera in the outliner. With the camera selected, come down on the right side here to this green camera icon here. And under viewport display, this hidden menu, unhide this menu and look at the passepartout right here, and move this value up and you can completely black out the back. Or move it down and it will be completely transparent. I like to make this a bit darker so I can really focus in on the image that I'm looking at. And then, like I said, this will zoom in and out only of the size of the frame that you're looking at. To control the camera in this viewport, it's quite a nice way to work, so I'll explain how to do this now. So if your camera's framed up, you have a nice big frame of what your render's going to look like. Hit N on the keyboard, and this menu will come out the side, and under view, choose the view option, and here you will see it says camera to view. Select camera to view, and now when you zoom in and out, your framing will stay, but you're going to kind of navigate the camera around the scene using this viewport. So you can see on the right side the camera is now moving. So if I press N to shut this menu down, I can now like frame up a shot in this however I want. So I'll maybe go this angle. So these controls now will control the camera. So as I said, you can see the camera moving here. You could also select this camera in the 3D space, hit G on the keyboard and grab and move the camera manually like this. But this is a nicer way to work directly with the viewport. So again, that is operated by using N on the keyboard and to turn off camera to view. So if I turn this off, I will now control the size of my frame, and if I turn this back on, I will now control the actual motion of the camera. So that's how to set up the camera, the look of the camera for the viewport. What we want to do now is add some depth of field and some controls over where we are looking with this camera. And the way we're going to do that is by using empties. So to add an empty, press Shift and A on the keyboard and navigate down to the empty option here. And under empty, you will have these different objects that we can work with, and I'm just going to work with the sphere to start off with. So drop the sphere into the scene, and we'll have this very large wireframe sphere appear. Hit S on the keyboard and drag your mouse down, and it will just scale this sphere down to a smaller, manageable size, about this size. This we can use as a focus object, and then we're going to create another one to use as a tracking object. So to copy this, with the empty selected, we know it's selected because it's highlighted orange, press Shift and D for duplicate, and I will get another empty like attached to the end of my mouse. And to drop this exactly in the same position, just hit Escape on the keyboard. And now I have two empties in the scene. One we will use for focus and one we will use for tracking. So we will rename these empty, focus, and empty tracking. These are already in our lights and camera sub-collection, like the scene collection, so that keeps things quite tidy. We will start with the focus one. So if you choose the camera, select the camera, and in the outliner on the bottom, we select the camera option here, this green one, and then we can look at the depth of field setting right here. So select the camera, select the green icon on the outliner, and then choose depth of field right here. Immediately you'll see like a blur start to happen, but we are controlling this now by distance, a distance of 10 meters, but what we want to control this by is the location of this focus empty. So for focus object, click this black space and choose empty focus, and now this empty will be our focal point. So you see now the focus is right in the middle of this plane, which is exactly where the empty is. It's right in the middle of this plane right here. So that will allow us to create a focus point, and then we can create a tracking point with this camera as well. And the way we add the tracking point is with the camera selected, the icon above this is the constraint. It's like this blue shape. Click Add Object Constraint and choose Track 2. With Track 2 selected, choose Target, and under Target choose Empty Tracking, and the camera will move slightly to focus directly on the tracking empty. So what we can do now with this activated, so again, if you have the camera selected, choose this blue icon here just above the camera called Constraints, and then Add Object Constraint, Track 2, and under Track 2 Target, choose Empty Tracking. And what that means now is if we take the empty tracking, we select this this empty, and we press G on the keyboard, and we move the mouse, we were now going to move this empty, and the camera is always going to track to it. So if we want to make a little animation of a camera movement, this is a nice way to do it. Or if we want to just change the direction the camera is pointed in, this is a nice way to do it as well. So G will allow us to move this up and down and around, but the origin point of the camera will stay the same. It will just change where this is rotated to and how it looks at the empty. So I'm going to move this empty kind of about here. And then to work with the focus empty, we want to look at this top down. And the way we do that is to use this gizmo right here. And if you click just on the upper Z axis, we will see this from the top view. So we're looking at this directly from the Z point of view. So if you choose empty focus and press G, we can now move this around the ground plane and move the point of focus that we're looking at. So if I move this right to the back, the camera will now focus on the back of this plane, and the front will fall into a blur. If I move this with, again, just hit G on the keyboard to grab it, and then your mouse should move this around. If I move this close to the camera, like the very, very foreground is going to be in focus now. And I kind of want it to be somewhere in between, about where this rock is here. So if I move the focus object just there and drop it, the camera is now focusing right on these few rocks here, and everything else is falling into the depth of field. We can control how wide this depth is, this focal depth, by going back into the camera options, select the camera, choose the green camera icon on the outliner, and then scroll down to the depth of field settings. And the f-stop is the number that you want to look at, and the smaller this is, the blurrier the image is. So if I put this down to 1, I will have a very blurry image with just a small amount of focus right in the middle. And if I put this up to 6, I will have less blur, but I still have some. So the higher this number is, the more blur you will have in the image. and the lower it is, the less. No, that's what I'm saying. So yeah, if I put this to 1, lots of blur. And if I put this to 5 or 6, less blur. For me, I probably want about a 3, so that it's not too blurry and it's not too sharp either, so we get this kind of natural look in the camera. Um, if you ever want to look at this render view here without the overlay, so without looking at the empties, without looking at these icons, you can click, just staying in layout mode. You can click this icon right here. This will be blue by default, and this icon is like 2 circles laid on top of each other. If you turn this off, it will turn off overlay. And what that means is we're just looking at the image now, we're not looking at any of the 3D scene information. But if I turn this back on, I will see where my empties are and I'll see what's selected in the outliner. So that's just a way for you to turn on and off what we're looking at. Right now this scene is set, so I'm going to save this scene with Control Shift and S, and I'm going to make a new version called ground texture, and I'm just going to save that. That is within my folder structure under the Blender scene. I'm just going to add ground texture and save that. Now we've got quite a nice look in this camera, so what we can do is, now we've saved it, we'll press F12 on the keyboard and we can render this out. So we'll very quickly see a render happen. We can speed this up and I can show you some settings to improve this. Right now we're using 4096 samples and it took 12 seconds to render. The image looks fine. I think we have a nice focus here. There's enough definition in the displacement map. The depth of focus is quite strong, so maybe we can reduce that. But yeah, using F12 will let us render this out, and now we can address some of these settings. So I'm gonna close this out and go over here to the render settings, which is in the back of the camera. So choose the icon that looks like the back of a camera, and here we have 2 different sets of render options. One is for viewport, which is here. So by default we're rendering 1024 samples. So if I change the viewport here, you will see 1024 samples are going to be rendered out automatically in viewport mode. Clicking in and out of this camera here is how we go in and out of camera mode. I don't know if I mentioned this, but this camera icon here will snap you in and out of camera mode. So this is viewport mode, and then just hit the camera icon and you'll snap back into camera mode. You know this is your active camera because this camera icon is selected here. So this is your active camera. This is the active camera view. The render view is set to 4000 samples, so we can change this to 2048, so we do half the amount. And this has denoising activated automatically. I'm going to turn this off and we're going to do denoise in compositing. The other setting to notice is the noise threshold, and this is set to 0.1 and this to 0.01. That is just how much noise the render will produce and how big this grain is. So this is a lot smaller than this. This is a lot quicker to calculate than this. This is obviously a 1/10 of the size of this, but for the render we want to keep the image as sharp as possible. So now we've reduced this setting, we know here where the sampling settings are, but for the resolution settings they will be under here. So this image looks like a printer and this will be the images that we create. So right now it's set to 1K, which is 1080p, and we can change these dimensions. So if we want a square composition, we can enter the same dimensions in both sides, so on the X and the Y axis, but I'm going to keep this layout, but here is where you control the resolution. The percentage, if I add 150%, it will render 150% bigger. If I add 200, it will render 200% bigger, but for now we can stick to 100%. So if we render this out now, if I turn this to shader mode and I press F12, I've reduced the total number of samples, so this should render out a lot quicker. 2048 samples, and this is now our rendered image. What I'm going to do with this now is go and have a quick look in compositing to make a few final changes. So the way we do that is I'll just minimize this window for now, this render window, and I'm going to go to the compositing workspace in the top of the screen. So in this compositing workspace, we're going to have a similar render node structure as we had before, but we'll be working with the render. And to activate this workspace in the compositing workspace, click Use Nodes here. And this will allow us to use a node system to change this image. If you've still got a render in your render view right here, this render layer should come in automatically. If not, you can select your layers here, click View Layer, and now we will have one render layer here. So this is the render layer and this is the composite. Right now we have nothing in between. This space works the same as the texturing space and the world space. Middle mouse button, N to close out these menus, and mouse button to scroll. Right now we can't see anything we're doing, so we're going to add in a view node. So press Shift and A, search, view, and we click viewer, drop this in, take from image, take this output and plug it into the image input here, and we will be able to view our image in the background now. So now we can kind of view what we're doing. We're going to add a Shift A, search, denoise. We're going to add Shift A, search, RGB curves, and we're going to press Shift A, add lens distortion. So these are the three we want to add, and the way you add them is, like I said, Shift A, search, denoise, Shift A, search, RGB curves, and Shift A, search, lens distortion. And now we're going to hook these all up to the compositor. The first note I want to make is with RGB curves, turn this to film-like, and with the lens distortion, we're going to add this in right at the end. So to start off with, we want to plug in, we want to connect image to image, image to image, and image to image. And a way to keep connections together is hold Control on the keyboard, select the sockets that you want, move them, and then drop them in the end of the one where you want it to go. So that Control and click will allow you to move two of them together. If you don't have Control clicked, you're going to work the other way. If you just click and drag, you're going to take a string to connect, but if you press Control, you're going to move those strings. So now there's nothing visible because we've disconnected the image. But if we connect from render layers into denoise, and from denoise into RGB curves, we now see the image because we have a full connection. And with this denoise, we've taken some of the noise out of the image. And with this RGB curves, what we can do is under C, with film-like attached, we can push this curve up a little bit on one side and down on another, and we can have an effect on how this lighting is working and some of these values. And we can separate this by color. So if we want to just affect red colors, we choose R for red, and we could drop this down and we start to take red out of the image. Or if we could push this up and it'll start to add red into the image. We want to just maybe take out a little tiny bit of the red and maybe push in a little bit of blue into this image. If we want to control the factor of this entire node, you can drop this factor slider up and down, and it will change the strength of how much this RGB is affecting anything. And maybe we'll leave it around here so that we have a little bit of color correction done. And then we could even press Shift A, search, hue saturation, drop a hue saturation value in here. Again, press Control to choose these connections, move them to the end, put them in image, reconnect image to image here. And now we can have like a saturation value that we can change a little bit. We can drop that down, make the image a bit gray. We could push it the other way. We could change the hue a little bit. So this again will give us a little bit of control on the color of the image. Maybe 0.51. You can experiment with these values. You can experiment with this to get like a nice color correction. And then the last thing we're going to add in is lens distort to just add the feeling of a camera lens. So again, brings the lens distort node over, Control and click on the image out, drop this into the image out on lens distort, and then connect hue saturation and image together. So again, Control and click will let you move multiple sockets together. Single click will let you move one socket at a time. Nothing's going to happen immediately because all these values are set to 0, but if I set this to 0.1, you'll see some kind of lens distortion happening around the edges of the image. This is still quite strong even for 0.1 value. So if I press 0.02, we'll get a very little bit of distortion around the edges of the image, which adds a bit of realness to what it is that we're trying to do with this compositing. And then if we go back here and look at our rendered output, this compositing is already applied to this image. So now if we go Image, Save As, and we navigate to our render folder in our folder structure, we can type in here new render with composite, and then we can save this image, and now this is saved. What's nice about this compositing space is if I close out this render and I go back to layout and I look at this in render view and I think, you know what, I want to move the camera, so I'm going to use the tracking constraint and I'm just going to move this like around a little bit so that this is more the focus. The depth of field feels quite strong, so I'm going to select the camera, go to camera, drop this down and change f-stop to 4.2 so that there is a bit less blur in this image. If I hit F12 now and render this out, the render layers we will render 2000 layers, and then the compositing will be applied on top. So initializing execution, and then there you see the compositing happens after. So to compare, this is no composite and this is with composite. So now we've set up the compositor. Every render we make will have the same color corrections and lens distortion effects that we have. So we could save this as a new version, and to save a new version, just hit this plus icon here and it will start to number these files from 1 upwards. So I can do new render 1 composition, save as image, and then all my renders now will have this compositing applied to them. So that is about it. That is how to set up a texture, how to set up a world light, how to set up a camera with some constraints, and how to navigate around Blender, how to use displacement. I think this should be a good introduction, so I hope you guys found it useful. Let me know in the comments if you guys have any questions or if things aren't working, and I'm happy to help.